and particles from the brain which had exploded onto the wall and about 4 or 5 feet up the wall, and occupying about 5 feet in diameter. And in that area they found not only blood and brain matter, but they also found shot from the shotgun. And they found no other shot, no other blood splatterings anywhere in the office. And they found a discharged shell in the shotgun, and they found the drapes had been pulled back, which was at the hands of Ms. Dixon. She testified to that. Now, what does this mean as far as suicide? Is this an accident, which you're going to have to decide, or suicide, as you're going to have to decide? You're going to have to determine the fact. And we submit this is how Mr. Dixon met his death. We're going to talk about that phone dangling again in a few minutes. But after he hung up from the conversation with Mr. Crow, his last desperate attempt to get some money, it was a failure. He lay down on that floor, and he put down his shotgun on his left side, being right-handed. He picked up the screwdriver, and he reached for the trigger. He put his left side of his head to the muzzle, and he pulled that trigger, pushed that trigger with the screwdriver. It exploded, and you saw the scene that I've already described. And that's how he met his death. There is no other plausible way that he could have accidentally shot himself and left that 4 to 5 feet upon the wall of blood and shot at that angle, in that position, in that diameter. Could it be an accident? You've heard some testimony that there may have been a shotgun that didn't have any safety or accidentally might go off. He knew that, and obviously a man with knowledge is not going to treat a rifle, a shotgun that's loaded, that has a defective safety, with anything but the utmost respect. He was aware of the act of the malfunction, if it had not been fixed. You can discard that. Was it a homicide? Did someone do this to him? I think you can discard that. The room was locked. There was no disturbance, no papers thrown around. It was his own gun. No one had come in there with a pistol and shot him. It was his own shotgun. The way the body was laid out, the way the office, nothing missing. I think you can see that it wasn't a homicide. But that may not set too well with you. It didn't set well with Ms. Dixon. That is, suicide. Why? Ms. Dixon can't understand why her husband would commit suicide. But a few things Ms. Dixon didn't know. Ms. Dixon didn't know anything about the business and financial transactions of her husband. She didn't know anything about his mortgaged home, the home she lived in, the loan that had been mortgaged to the bank, the loan that had been taken out to the hilt. She didn't know anything about that. She didn't know anything about the $20,000 of worthless Canadian stock that he had purchased. She didn't know anything about the depleted bank book that had over $20,000, she thought, just a few months previously. And when she examined it, it had about $500 in it. She didn't know anything about the insurance policy that brings us to court today. She wasn't even aware of that. And she wasn't aware of the Attorney General's investigation. She wasn't aware that her husband was suspected of not turning in fees of some $18,000 to $20,000 to the Attorney General. She didn't know he was under investigation. She didn't know that he had received letters, and she didn't know he had an appointment with the investigator the following week. And neither was she aware that the day before the suicide, that her husband had gone down to try to borrow money on this insurance policy that he had just taken out. She didn't know that he had talked to Mr. Wilson and used desperate about 3 times. She didn't know that he had told Mr. Wilson, quote, and I wrote this down, God, God, what am I going to do? She didn't know that when her husband went in to purchase the worthless Canadian stock that he told Mr. Crow that he was in pretty bad financial shape and he'd like to make some money quick, that he couldn't take out some reasonable stock, he needed speculative stock. And she wasn't aware that about 9 o'clock in the morning that he was killed, that he was found dead, the morning that he committed suicide. She wasn't aware that he phoned Mr. Crow that very morning needing $6,000 by noon. And again he was desperate. And that's the time he told Mr. Crow that he was worth more dead than alive. I wrote that down. He says it's $50,000 plus $50,000 if I die by accident, referring to this very same insurance policy. And then finally, I am in a devil of a mess. And there were certain corroborating circumstances that I'll just briefly mention, and you'll think of many more when you go into that jury room. You'll recall the mood that he was in the night before, the fact that he didn't eat breakfast that very morning, the fact that the drapes were drawn. But I want you to remember what I said we'd get back to, and that was that phone that was dangling off the hook. And you recall Mr. Crow said that we terminated the conversation that morning after Mr. Dixon had indicated how desperate he was. But Mr. Crow did not hear any click indicating the receiver had been hung up. That was the time that the full desperate situation came home to Mr. Dixon. He didn't even hang up the phone when his last chance to make the 12 o'clock noon deadline turned out. And that's when he laid himself on the floor and did his last desperate act, the act which precluded the insurance policy money being paid in this case. Now, the job of a juror is not an easy job, especially in the face of evidence which might conjure up some sympathy. You've got to have courage. And it takes courage to argue for the law when emotion and sympathy is on the other side. But the law is the foundation of society, and that's why upholding the law is just as important, and in this case more important, than bending the sympathy. When you take the judge's instruction and you apply the evidence in this case to those instructions and reach your verdict in this case, you'll be upholding the law. And you'll have a good feeling. And it's a feeling of upholding the law and doing the right thing and upholding the public policy of not paying off or suicide in a policy. It's going to make you feel good when you leave that jury room. It's going to make you feel good tomorrow. It's going to make you feel good a year from now. So what we're asking you is do your duty, listen to the law, put aside sympathy, and come back with a verdict that speaks the truth, that is, a finding for the defendant in this case.